Thank you all for joining us this evening. Welcome to another edition of World Affairs, Conversations That Matter. And welcome to Matthew Buffington, who is a communications director at NASA down at Ames Research Center, which is in the heart of the Silicon Valley, and who also happens to have a background in the State Department. So he can put some of the aspects of NASA into a global context for us, and I'm looking forward to this conversation this evening. We're actually, Matthew, you actually are very fortunate in that I think you work for the one government agency that everybody loves.
Yes, it's completely different from, yes, indeed. Having worked on like foreign policy where people tend to be grumpy from time to time. But yeah, everybody loves NASA.
So why is that? I mean, I know, I have my own reasons. I'm of that generation that experienced the moon landing and the thrill of America really achieving that pinnacle of scientific discovery and technological development. But why is it you think, and I think it's in part the intention, NASA's intention to, in fact, spread that very positive feeling to the rest of the population, not only because they want to continue to get their budget on an annual basis, but also because it seems to be part of the tradition of this. It's part of the DNA of NASA.
I think like in the moon landing is the epitome of being able to do big things. And so I think that's a huge inspiration. I mean, like not only for people who grew up during the Apollo era and got to live through that, but for me, even as a kid of like seeing the shuttle program, it was just like, I mean, NASA's been one of those organizations that is like, it bridges like even like the political divide. It's like whether it's like left or right, everybody loves NASA. I think one of my earliest experiences of trying to of figuring this out was I got to go to a space launch. It was SpaceX 6. It was the first time that they ever launched a rocket and then landed it on a barge. And I was sitting there.
And that was done. This was Elon Musk's company. Is that right?
Exactly. And this was probably about like 2 years ago. It was in March, and it was my first time ever seeing a rocket launch. I'd only been working for NASA for like maybe 6 months, and I got to see my first rocket launch. And just keep in mind, if you ever have your heart set on watching a rocket launch, like very often it gets scrubbed. It could be weather, it could be somebody driving a boat in the middle of the ocean. Like for any reason, like things can get canceled. So I was very fortunate to actually get to watch it. But like I remember sitting in kind of like the bullpen where all the press, and it's a whole mix of like the like the traditional like space press that people have been following NASA for years, but then also your typical CNNs and like in like Washington Post, people who cover those launches. But like I was thrown off because there were journalists with the NASA meatball on their laptops. You would never see that at the State Department. You go to a daily press briefing and see a State Department sticker on that. Like that's not gonna happen. But I think it's just evident to like how it's like how much goodwill and positivity that NASA brings.
Yes,
so.
I think you're right. There are fewer fanboys for the State Department and perhaps for other parts of the U.S. government. You mentioned, and you brought this up, this SpaceX.
Totally.
This is one of the things that I think is becoming a much more interesting development around the world is the privatization of space exploration, of rocket launches. Maybe the Russians were in fact the first ones to do this when their Soviet space program fell apart. They started offering rides to private individuals who were interested in taking a ride up into orbit. I think Charles Shimoni was one of the guys who ended up going. But when you went to that launch, that wasn't at the Kennedy Space Center, was it?
Oh, it was.
Oh, so where? It was. But it landed on a barge.
It landed on a barge. We had the video. In fact, there was a SpaceX guy who was in with. I was with like the press group, but then there was another building over there where SpaceX was doing their launch coverage. But like typically, like there's a mix between the NASA coverage and the SpaceX coverage. So, but yeah, there was a SpaceX person there, and I'll tell you what, the excitement of when it landed, it permeated through. Like it wasn't just like the SpaceX people; it was like the NASA people were elated. It's like you talk about the commercialization.
Yeah, and the private, and it sounds as if there's this private-public relationship.
And it's not a new ththing. The example that I always like to give is like aeronautics. So like the traditional you think in 1903 when the Wright brothers proved the first flight. Then very quickly the NACA, and I'm trying to remember what it's like, the National. I'm gonna mess up the acronym.
It's okay,
but
we won't hold you to the your
I better
agency
throw it out.
may
I
get
could
back
make
at-
something
yeah.
up, but it was the predecessor to NASA. It was an advisory council for aeronautics. Started off at Langley,
Yes.
out over near outside of Hampton, Virginia, and it. Like aeronautics started off as a heavily government thing, the government like investing in it, trying to understand it and trying to study it. Airmail came from that, where it was like, you got to find some reason to make these airplanes. So instead of, putting the mail on trains or going back and forth across the country, they started flying it. That wouldn't have existed without the government investment. And eventually, the aeronautics industry, especially after World War II, it grew. Then there was like public-private partnerships. You think of like Pan Am, some of those early predecessors. And then over time, it became more private industry. It went from heavily government funded to partnerships and different like mixes to a fully fledged like industry in of itself with your American Airlines and your Delta. But NASA still does a heavy research role in aeronautics to this day. But right now they're working on call it the low flight boom demonstrations. Like how can you fly across the country where the sonic boom becomes more of a sonic thump? So you can fly super fast and not shatter people's windows. But that is very much an analogy for where space is going. Heavily government funded, then it moves into like international partnerships, then it moves into a public-private, and then you're starting to see the beginnings of an actual hopefully self-sustaining private industry that can do rocket launches. And that's kind of the goal of moving it into where government invests, they do partnerships and then work it into its own industry. And we're just kind of at those exciting beginning stages of that.
Well, that's interesting because you really describe something that's true across the board in the United States, which is heavy R&D investment.
Yep.
Of course, DARPA is one of the more prominent examples.
Thank you for the internet.
Yes, thank you for the internet, and I think Facebook thanks you for the internet as
I'm
well.
sure.
But it was done with government funds, and then eventually this R&D developed a basic science that then developed an infrastructure that allowed for private industry to build upon that.
Yep.
And that was very helpful to the United States during the entire 20th century. But as we move into the 21st century, we're finding that some of this R&D that the United States is now expending its resources on is not limited to national development, that these infrastructural developments, whether they be in the scientific realm or elsewhere, can actually be leveraged by other countries, some of them being pure competitors. How do we do? Does NASA think about this? I mean, I know it's probably unfair to ask you whether the U.S. government should be spending money on infrastructure and technology development. But
my boss will be very interested in my answer.
I'm interested in your answer. But the question really is because NASA, while it has national in its title, it is the National Aeronautics and Space Administration.
Yep.
Really has an international component
Very
as well,
much so.
where you actually share with multiple countries the developments that you create, and of course the missions that you pursue.
I think that's the nature of being like research in a science organization, because the scientific community is international, and it's like. We have a whole mix of different partnerships and programs. Like you think of just, for example, the Kepler spacecraft that was the first to confirm that exoplanets, existed. It's like we gather that data and we get it out to the scientists. Because honestly, if it was only NASA, physicists and scientists working on this stuff, it's not nearly going to be as beneficial as if you get it out to the broader community. From the American public, it's like y'all already paid for this through your taxes. So it's a matter of us gathering that data and then getting it out back to the community. And actually, science progresses faster that way. So it's kind of built into the system.
And there, of course, we were talking about this a little earlier. You and I personally, we were talking about the International Space Station, which is an example of collaborative work with other countries, where in fact there is a cumulative development of technologies. This is, of course, with the Russians, first the Soviets and now the Russians. The ISS up there, Mir.
Canadians up there, and Japanese up there. It's like a whole mix. It truly is an international space station.
But politics invariably intervenes, even with this feel-good organization, NASA, for example, with some of the sanctions that the United States has recently instituted against Russia. Part of the result has been also a prevention of some of rocket technology from Russia coming to the United States. I believe there's going to be a sanction against their, is it the RD-150? I'm not quite sure what that rocket is.
I would ask somebody much smarter than me on what it was.
The one that launches the Atlas V.
Okay.
And so when you have this intervention of politics overlaid with something that we feel very strongly about and that we actually feel very good about in terms of the collaborative nature, how are we supposed to, how is an agency like yours supposed to deal with it when, for example, this particular rocket is no longer going to be available after a certain amount of time?
Well, because I mean, I'm far from the expert on the policy of Russian sanctions, and I know that but I was fortunate that just last week the NASA administrator was in Silicon Valley, and he hosted the NASA Advisory Council, and he did talk briefly about some of this stuff, just in the sense of, I think previously when he was a congressman. The vote to Russian sanctions, that was a purposeful, not having the NASA collaboration included in that. But it is one of the epitome of NASA's soft power is the epitome of diplomacy, where even when there's contentious disagreements in geopolitical things at work, it's very fortunate that this scientific and exploration has been able to rise up out of this. And I know there was a lot of stories and things related to even just because let's be real. Right now, Russia, we pay for Russia to send our astronauts up since the shuttle program ended.
That's right, 2011, is
exactly,
that right?
when it concluded.
So no more shuttles, and now you get a ride in the Soyuz.
Basically, and the good thing is that the shuttle program, these things all have a life cycle. They eventually phase out, they age, they're no longer viable. The fortuitous thing that we have is, instead of NASA spending a lot of money to build and supervise their own rockets to do something like to go to low Earth orbit, which we've kind of proven that we could do with the shuttle, now you can look to industry to kind of fill that void, and look to American industry to fill that void, like SpaceX, Boeing, Starliner. So we don't have to worry about launch. We've actually already proven that this could happen with the commercial resupplies. So right now, supplies that goes to the International Space Station, like SpaceX or different space companies, we'll put those payloads on rockets and send it up to the International Space Station. And so now it behooves us that the next step of that is putting humans and putting astronauts on those, because and then that way NASA is free to then invest that money in the Space Launch System, into bigger rockets that do bigger things that there's probably not a private company that'll be able to make those, at least in the short term. So I know that's pivoting so that we're not reliant on Russia for those launches anymore, and instead working and helping to create a sustainable commercial industry in this is exciting.
Well, and the president seems to be very big on trying to privatize this. He says billionaires love their rockets. And so, in fact, he is really encouraging the direction that you're talking about, which is the privatization of some of this launching.
And this goes into, this isn't new. This happened in aviation. This happened in aeronautics. It's now going to start happening in space. This even talked about when the NASA administrator, Jim Bridenstine, was speaking to the council, was talking about going to the moon, and how the moon can be a proving ground to eventually go to Mars. And it was just we're not doing it like last time. This isn't like flags and footprints. The idea is to come up with the concept of what would a space station around the moon look like, and what would rovers look like? What would this be? But then we don't have to do it on our own. Space is really hard, but we don't have to do this on our own. And so it's a matter of coming up with those plans and with those ideas and sharing it to the community, to the scientific community. And hopefully, just as the space station was international, hopefully the moon exploration can also be international and commercial. And hopefully then there's a whole industry that can grow out of it, because that tends to be the more sustainable thing. And then you also get crazy innovations that nobody's ever thought of. The whole time with the shuttle, the shuttles came back, but those rocket boosters, they fell and they weren't used again. Mm-hmm. The innovation of having rockets that can launch and then land is amazing. And NASA's super excited about that. Right. And that can make that price go much cheaper. So instead of NASA having to build their own rockets to go to the space station, we can look at companies and for significantly cheaper just pay for that service.
Sure.
So.
And in fact, there are other countries that are looking to our launches for satellite launching and the like. But it really is remarkable that we have recyclable rockets at this point.
Yeah, it's like, especially as you talk about like, SpaceX and the things that they're doing, it's like nobody's more excited about this than NASA is, because then it's like, it's cool. Then that's the thing that we're not having to do or put money into of the budget. Then we can just pay them to do that specific thing.
Right. And, again, and this is on the private side, but, you mentioned the space shuttle. I remember when I lived in the Soviet Union, I used to be a reporter there and I worked for NBC. There was a model, nearly exact copy of the space shuttle called the Buryat, which was, I'm sure they did not come up with the technology entirely on their own. It had remarkable similarities to the NASA space shuttle, which actually pivots me into the question of sort of NASA as a national organization, one that is tied to our own national interests, whether they be our economic interests or our research and development interests. And there is, in the way that NASA has helped industry evolve, it's also been has worked hand in glove with our military services. It has been a key component in helping to be a proving ground for ballistics, for example, and for other aspects of the U.S. military. How would you then look at today's relationship between NASA and the Department of Defense, in particular, now that the president has made it clear that he is interested in a Space Force?
I mean, we've always been working with the military,
yes.
And it's like, in fact, a lot of the astronauts. There's a lot of people who have like backgrounds in military.
Many Air Force, right? I mean, those who were initially astronauts were Air Force pilots.
Like our very own NASA administrator was a Navy fighter pilot. So yeah, I mean, working in the interagency between NASA and the Department of Defense is not new or different. The Space Force is always a fun one, especially if anybody spends time on the internet. It's like, it's an interesting aspect because I mean, NASA is civilian and it is about like science and like space exploration. It is not military. And Space Force, I mean, the thing is like Space Force under a different name already exists within the Air Force. If you were to look at 70 years ago, the Air Force didn't exist. I think it was like 71. I may be off, but like the Air Force didn't exist. And then it finally got to the point where it existed within the Army. And then the Army finally got to a point where it's like command and control on the ground is completely different from control in the skies. Similarly, control in the skies and what, pilots and drones have to deal with is different from protecting our GPS satellites. So like spinning that off, I mean, it's really not, it doesn't necessarily impact NASA as much because, it's just a matter of spinning off what already exists within the Air Force into its own thing. But it's all military, so it's not really our domain.
Right. Yeah, if and when a space command is stood up, they'll call you occasionally for tips, but they won't necessarily be merging with you.
Well, exactly. No, definitely not merging. But this is a thing where, NASA has trailblazed a lot of this stuff. I mean, we work actively with the FAA. So a lot of people don't even think about like the FAA, but like NASA and at NASA Ames specifically works a lot on the air traffic management system. So in fact, there's a whole air traffic control simulator that they have. We have all these windows and they can do different simulations for air traffic controllers to test out data. They put different software in to see how can you get more efficient of getting planes that land and take off, of finding efficiencies. We develop that and then we hand it over to the FAA, to the regulators, to actually then implement it. And we're working on that same concept, but in the area of drones.
Oh, great. Thank you. Well, I had one outside my window recently, and I was wondering how it got to the 9th floor.
Well, and it's also the difference between Especially in the world of like if it's Amazon or Domino's Pizza delivering, a pizza to your house via drone. It's like, or even people who are hobbyists and who want to take photos, there needs to be an air traffic control system for those drones. And what NASA has been working on, they call it UTM. And it's a tortured acronym, as tends to be the case. But it's Unmanned Aerial Systems Traffic Management. And it's basically a software where anybody, so if you're delivering a package, anybody who's operating the drone can type it in, and then it follows the path. It adjusts so it doesn't run into other drones. It adjusts for the weather. Because you can imagine like how chaotic like air traffic control is now.
Yes.
Imagine all of those humans trying to do air traffic control for drones,
Right.
and hundreds of them. It just doesn't make any sense. And so the UTM, the air traffic control system for drones that NASA is working on, the software is an autonomous system, so that so that we can exist in that space. There can be a commercial space for that, to send drones back and forth without them crashing, without them running into weather patterns. So that's a whole new industry that comes out from the government investment. But that's one of those things where NASA creates it, and they've actually run several tests. I believe in Nevada they did some, in Charlotte they ran some different tests to prove that this works. And once it's solid, then you hand it over to the FAA to start implementing it. And hopefully you won't get people buzzing your
That would be
buzzing your
good.
thing.
It would be helpful. So how far would you imagine that this UTM system is from implementation?
I have no. I
Right.
don't know.
Okay. Well,
I know.
so
I
I'm
know
not holding my-
exactly who I would ask.
Okay.
But you'd have to. I'd have to get back to you on that one.
So let's take and then I'd like to do a tour a tour of what it is NASA's really doing these days. But
Excellent.
I'd also first like to see sort of what's going on around the world. I mean, there are a number of nations that are now looking at exploration, independent exploration. I think China, for instance, is planning on going to the moon. We've been there, but I think they want to go visit as well. And so what other countries should we look at this point? Is India planning a space program?
Well, I think NASA would welcome anybody and everybody to come join the party. It's like the more people that we have like doing space exploration that have interest in it, and it doesn't mean that they need their own fully fledged launching rockets. It's like people can have their part of this exploration and part about this scientific endeavor. Like everybody doesn't have to recreate the wheel. With our powers combined, we can be more efficient. An interesting one, as you mentioned, India was. When talking about returning back to the moon,
Yes.
You think from the time that Apollo first steps on the moon until I think it was 1972, where we left and we didn't go back. The idea was that like the moon was bone dry, like there's nothing there, there's nothing interesting. It was seen as human exploration, but it wasn't really scientifically interesting until 2008. India helped discover oh wait, no, we think there's ice could be on the moon. And then actually some different programs, you think of LADEE and LCROSS, that came out of NASA Ames as well, proved that was indeed the case. There was this system where it was like a spacecraft about the size of a bus followed by a Volkswagen, where it went through, and I don't know if you guys remember this or not, it was when it impacted into the moon.
Yes.
And it set that bus off in front, it made a big poof, and then the other thing before it crashed in gathered that data and shot it back. And it confirmed that not only is there water ice on the moon, there is buckets of water ice on the moon. But you think from 72 to 2008, it's bone dry. Why would we ever want to go? To now, it's like there's resources. When there's ice on the moon and in that abundance, that means that there's H2O. You have oxygen to breathe. You have hydrogen to power rockets. So going back to the moon this time around, fundamentally different with international partners, with commercial partners, and trying to find out what those resources are. Another thing that our administrator was talking about that I found really fascinating is you think of precious earth metals, not really earth metals because they came from asteroids. There's asteroids have all kinds of precious metals that are very relevant, that are very, they hit the earth, we find them, but there's erosion, there's all kinds of things that make it more difficult. Take a look at the moon. How many asteroids have been hitting that thing? So there is a possibility there could be precious metals there that could be that would make it worthwhile and have a viable business case for commercial industry to actually go and mine the moon. So I don't know, a lot of really exciting things that pivoted. And I went all the way to the moon and mining, all the way from just a comment on India. So
well, that's interesting.
You let me go on a tangent. That's how it's going to go.
I love it. One of the comments that's often brought up when we talk about space exploration is that we know more about space today than we know about the deep blue ocean that is on our very own Earth. Does NASA do any of this, even though it's not in its title?
Actually, quite a bit, because the thing is, as you better understand life on Earth, particularly in the oceans, particularly in crazy conditions, that's how then we better know what those signatures are to look for in space. We have a podcast that we've been doing, the NASA Silicon Valley podcast. We've turned that into a live show, and we had the administrator on just last week for that. And the second part, after Jim left, we talked to a NASA project called Subsea, which is a tortured acronym that I have no idea what it stands for. I'd have to look it up to find out. But what they are doing is they're off the coast of Hawaii, and they're studying life in those extreme conditions. And it's a part of like our astrobiology mission to better understand if life can exist, if microbial life can exist in these crazy acidic volcanic waters, then maybe there's then the possibility within the universe in Enceladus or Europa or outside of our solar system just increases exponentially. But not only that, and I was talking with a group of students before, there's another person over at NASA who's looking at coral reefs. Similar to our Earth science mission, but Vade, and I'm going to butcher his last name, but we actually had him on the podcast. Yes. And he talked about it. He created an algorithm where it takes the distortion of the optics within water and kind of makes sense out of it, so you can look through it and see clearly. It takes that messed up message from the optics and makes it clear. And they're using it to look at the coral reefs to understand the deterioration. And from a space view, from a satellite, looking down, accounting for the optics that happen through the ocean and understanding how coral reefs are being affected. Oceans are a part of like what we're doing and looking on, both for the search for life, but also in understanding the planet, understanding our favorite planet.
Yes, it is my favorite planet.
Yes.
But I did see this movie called The Martian, which I'm sure somebody has brought up to you in the past.
Of course. Andy Weir is a local.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, he lives in Silicon Valley.
Well, there you go. So you have the Martian in your neighborhood, and it is part of your long-term mission at NASA to, in fact, reach Mars, not only in the way that we have up to now, which is with explorers and the like, but with humans. A human being.
Yep, that's the goal.
Talk about that a little bit.
Well, and as we've very heavily emphasized, it's the moon to Mars. It's like, let's go to the moon, but not the way we did before. With the international community, with commercial partners, prove that we can exist on the moon. One thing that also talk about, think of the International Space Station, low Earth orbit. They're doing tons of science experiments, and found out that when humans spend a year in the International Space Station, there's bone density issues, there's optical issues. There's also, when you finally go back into a gravity well, there's a sickness and it takes some time to recover. You don't want to figure that out after you've sent somebody on an 8-month mission to Mars to realize, oh, now he has osteoporosis and his bones are breaking. You don't want to find that out in that moment, especially considering then you're going to wait for a 2-year window to be able to even get back. Yeah. So we're using low Earth orbit in the International Space Station now to understand how humans can live on long-term in space. Then that moves into the moon, of going back there, setting up a space station that circles the moon, and using that as a proving ground to then eventually head off to Mars. But in the meantime, we're not leaving Mars alone. We have the rovers that are there now, and I believe Mars Insight is on its way there. And so, until we can send our human counterparts, sending robots will have to do in accounting for that. So.
Right, and are we sending potatoes up there too so that we can grow those?
You don't want to know how they're fertilized. But no moons, no potatoes at this point in time.
So going in the other direction, I'm looking forward to the Mars expedition. It'll be something that's really remarkable and something that we would never really talk about a few years ago, but now is suddenly within the realm of possibilities.
Well, and you mentioned like the Mars, the fortuitous thing is like when I left the State Department and joined NASA, it was right when that movie came out. Mm-hmm. So it was like the best timing, and I remember it constantly got referred to as NASA's Top Gun moment.
Right.
So yeah, it was a good moment to say, hey, I'm joining NASA now.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on your
Hey.
timing. There's aside from going to planets near and far, there's also this exploration that is going to approach the sun, the Parker Solar Probe. And if I were in the joking mood, I would ask if we're going to approach it at night. But, the reality is that I need the rim shot on that.
Don't forget to tip your bartenders and waitresses.
But this is a remarkable mission as well. And it's the Parker Solar Probe, is that correct?
You're going to go kiss the sun.
And so, and keep the probe cool during its entire approach using some kind of carbon fiber contraption that you've developed.
The crazy,
not you personally.
Well, not me personally. They wouldn't want me near it. But the Parker Solar Probe, the crazy thing about the sun, and is that like I'm going to butcher it. I'm not even going to try. The outside of the sun is actually hotter than parts of the inside, which completely defies logic. Why would like a part that's closer into the sun be cooler than the outside? We don't really know why. And part of it, the cool thing about this, the sun and what this probe is going to work on, like the sun is the source for like a lot of the solar wind. And you have like big solar like flares, you have these events that happen. This can really mess up our GPS. It can really mess up our satellites. It could mess up humans, like the radiation peak. It's like, it behooves us to understand how the sun functions. And so the cool thing about this mission is to better understand how does the outside of the sun work? How does those weather systems? So hopefully we can predict and better understand and see the telltale signs to better protect ourselves. So it is a really fascinating, fun, cool mission, which will help us out, not just like because yay, science, and we want to understand how things work, but it has real tangible benefits for us as humans that enjoy our GPS on our phone.
And I also like the Northern Lights, which is something that I get to, maybe you'll help me understand that a bit more.
I can put you in contact with people that can help you better understand it.
But it really is beautiful. So if you ever get into the northern part of the hemisphere at the time when the Northern Lights are,
excellent!
It's really remarkable to see. Okay, I am going to jump to questions from our audience because I've grilled you enough, and from Ephraim, who's in our audience, he asks, does NASA have a plan or is working in a plan to control climate change? And I think that's probably as relevant a question now because of the various political questions around climate change surrounding Washington, D.C. and the number of denial that exists, the amount of denial that exists around climate change.
Well, like climate change is definitely real, and it is definitely like man-caused. And like you talk to any NASA scientist, and they'll tell you all day in, day out. Now, like, the way that he phrased the question of to control climate change, I don't know if it's necessarily control it, but understanding what climate, like. If you look online, you'll see the GIF or the video of the temperatures when they use the heat map and how over the years it keeps getting hotter and hotter and hotter. This is a thing that like NASA spends a lot of time and effort into understanding how the climate is changing and why, to then turn that information to the policymakers and the people to what to do about it. NASA is not, we're not policymakers, but it's mainly like, this is the facts, this is the data, this is what it is. Because it's not just of like climate change because now Venice is flooding or that Miami's going to flood. This was like real tangible things, as Jim Bridenstine gave an example of like as a fighter pilot that like, the military having to protect area in the Arctic that nobody ever was before. But with things melting and land being exposed, all of a sudden there's geopolitical and even there's military aspects to it. Like if you're a farmer, like you care a lot about climate change because like the NASA data that we get from the satellites help with crop yields, help with understanding erosion. It helps with there's more aspects than just what people traditionally think of the bigger looming danger of climate change. There's also real tangible benefits to our food production that play into that, and then also like geopolitical, like military, like implications. So, but NASA's our role is to do the science and get that out to the scientific community and make that available. So that then the policymakers and the voters can make their decisions on what to do.
So you do have this remarkable collection of scientists in your
Very much so.
organization, and climate change, for example, since we're on that topic, is something that you can observe both from the heavens but also here on Earth. Do you have scientists, or is part of your mission to do this across the board, or are you strictly limited to what you can do from a satellite?
It's both. In fact, the U.S. Geological Survey is like actually based out of Menlo Park here in the Bay Area, is moving to NASA Ames, like to our NASA Research Park. They're locating there, and there's already a lot of like. We actually did a 4-episode series on our podcast just about how we're working together of like, we like to call it orbit to core. We're working with the U.S. Geological Survey, but then also working with our satellites to better understand the Earth from the orbit to the core. But I mean, if I think about NASA and even how we kind of divide it up into like what our major themes are, yes. One of the, like I wrap NASA in the pretty bow of exploration. Yes. Exploration is the core of why NASA exists. I think it's a core thing of the human condition is, exploring. But one of the major chunks of that is understanding the Earth. It is exploring the Earth and understanding the Earth. We explore Earth, it's explore flight, and then we move moon to Mars, humans in space, International Space Station, solar system and beyond, and space tech. The major chunks of how we divide up NASA. Earth science is one of those large chunks.
Fascinating, and then we were talking about beyond. What would
solar
you put
system
into
and beyond?
Yeah, solar system and
it's
beyond.
It's kind of like the end of Gilligan's Island and the rest. Solar system and beyond. You think of like you have New Horizons, the spacecraft that went to Pluto. And is going to be visiting another Kuiper Belt object in the next couple months.
So this was the satellite that was slingshotted around a bunch of planets.
Yes, over and over until it finally hit Pluto and got these crazy, awesome like photos or images of Pluto and what Pluto looks like, and understand that Pluto has an atmosphere.
Yeah,
we didn't know that before. So that's where we loop in. There's the solar system, but then there's the beyond part where, you look up into the night sky. Like, you're not really seeing stars. What you're seeing are individual solar systems. We've confirmed that like almost every star that you look at has planets, at least one or two. More likely, one of the nearby ones that we confirmed had 7 planets around it. It's like every star that you're looking at in the night sky has planets. And so that was confirmed from the Kepler spacecraft that is kind of ending, it's into its 19th campaign right now. That was the first spacecraft that confirmed that the exoplanets existed. Before that, people weren't even really sure. And following up on Kepler, the TESS, space telescope had just recently launched, and it's looking at a much bigger like swath of the night sky, looking at that, and then also the James Webb Telescope when that launches. So that's our beyond part of understanding exoplanets and what those and what the black holes, everything else out in the cosmos.
So let me just follow up on that really quickly before I go to one of the more questions from the audience.
I'm very loquacious. So.
Yeah, well, so you're surrounded again by these scientists who are thinking about not just our solar system, but the solar system and beyond. And if you were to guess, and maybe you even have a number, how many of your colleagues believe in life outside, however you define
like
it, where
aliens, intelligent life, or whatever. I have. This is my experience. Yeah. I don't think I've met anybody who doesn't believe that aliens that there's life on other planets. I haven't met anybody at NASA that doesn't think that. And that's from my personal experience.
Sure.
In fact, actually,
You work there.
one of my interview questions when I was interviewing for this job was, I remember Michael McKay, our director for science, they gave me this question and was basically at that hinting that we could possibly be close to confirming life within our solar system. Granted, probably microbial life.
Sure.
But and the question for the job interview was like, what do you do? That announcement happens. How do you handle it? But yeah, I mean, Enceladus is a very exciting prospect. It actually has like geysers. It's like shooting stuff, and from like examining the spray that's coming out of that and sending like probes through it, understanding that it has the elements that could harbor life. And so that's the really exciting part of, going to these, like to Europa, to these ice moons to see if microbial life could possibly exist. The same thing even with Mars. We've only scratched the surface on Mars. Mary Beth Wilhelm, one of the scientists at NASA Ames, co-wrote the paper when they discovered like water ice. I mean, not water ice, but like actually liquid water on Mars. That was never even, I mean, it's really cold. Turns out, when it's very briny, salty water, it doesn't freeze the same way as normal. But then they saw these streaks coming down the sides of the mountains from the satellite data, and she co-wrote that paper. So we only scratched the surface on Mars, so I wouldn't necessarily rule out Mars of, who knows what that has a little bit deeper. We're just like literally scratching the surface. So.
Well, it's really remarkable, and it certainly raises spiritual questions and questions of those who have a religious question about their own lives and our role and purpose in this universe. And so, but I'm not going to go down that path. But at NASA, but it is remarkable, and the images that have come back from Mars, for example, have just been so tantalizing.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking forward to greater, which brings me to another question from the audience, which is, to what extent do the objectives and the missions at NASA change with each new administration?
This is just for me as a perspective of a government employee. That's kind of how the game works, is that you realize that you work for the American people. And, and every administration changes at NASA. I mean, honestly, I've been kind of more surprised on like some things that have stayed the same. I mean, in the Obama administration, there was a big push of like Journey to Mars. But buried in the messaging in there was also using Moon as a proving ground. It's like cislunar. So for me, at least in my brain, it was like the pivot from like primarily focusing on the Moon then to Mars wasn't that much of a stretch. NASA, we've been very fortunate that even like budget-wise and stuff, like we're really in good shape. In fact, in the last budget, the administration bumped it up another $1 billion, so it went from 19 to 20, and then when it went to Congress, it got another like $0.7 billion. So it's like it still represents like half of 1%, so don't get too excited. But it is one of those things where it's like NASA really enjoys bipartisan support, and so we're very fortuitous with that. I mean, even if you look at the 10 NASA centers, you have 3 of them in California, you have them in Texas and in Florida and in Ohio and Virginia. NASA gets across the board, it gets support, and it's a great place to be at.
I have a question here that asks about this recent air leak on the ISS.
On the ISS, I remember.
And first this was thought to be space trash, and now is being labeled as a human error from a drill. Can you...
And I believe they patched it up.
Yeah, but I heard that at first an astronaut, or maybe it was a cosmonaut, I'm not sure who, used his finger to plug up the hole, this minor hole, that's right, maybe it was a Dutch astronaut, that's right, thank you. But how is NASA, the question here from the audience is, how is NASA preparing for increased security as more people are being sent to space?
Yeah, I mean, increased security, I guess in security in the sense of protecting our assets.
Or maybe the question is really, how do you mitigate against certain types of risks?
I mean, not anybody can just go up into the space station. It's like even like it's.
You don't have to go through a metal detector to go in there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a small group of
Yes.
people that are able to jump on or have the means to jump into a rocket. And even then, I'm pretty sure, even if you have the money to pay to go, I'm sure there's, it's like there's a checklist. I'm sure.
Okay.
So, yeah, I that's not my area of expertise.
Okay.
But honestly, it's like, yeah.
But this seems to be, I mean, I think the question gets at, there's an awful lot of risk in exploration. And as you say, NASA's real role is...
If our primary concern was safety, we wouldn't strap humans to explosive rockets and launch them into the air. There's innately a part of exploration is risk.
Yes.
That's just the nature of the beast. If we were super risk averse, we'd never leave our homes. But yeah, I mean, at least in terms of security in a space station, and it's pretty rigorous to get there. So. Yeah, I think they're like all the checks that exist probably already do.
Right.
So,
well, I ride a motorcycle, so I'm already I took my risk to get here this evening.
Less traffic, though.
Yes, much less traffic, and parking is remarkable as it is in space.
And this
Although
proves,
it's getting pretty crowded in
and this
orbit,
proves to the students that I was talking to earlier, you can't have a conversation in the Bay Area without talking about traffic or housing prices. Every conversation eventually goes there.
So shall we talk about housing prices in space? I mean, I understand there's a lot of real estate that's available. Steve from the audience says that Andy Weir said the first human trip to Mars will probably happen not earlier than about 2050. Are you getting different estimates, or what do you think?
I don't know. I think I'm trying to coach this in the idea that people, I know a lot of the criticism is that we're always 30 years away. But hopefully with the space launch system gets us that much closer. Getting back to the moon in a different way, not flags and footprints, but international and commercial, hopefully can set us up into a way that, to make it more possible, even with the space launch system, as that gets fully functioning, which will be the largest rocket to ever exist. Hopefully, it becomes a more realistic things. I'm hopeful for the 30s, but.
Well, these are long lead.
Yeah, this is like space is really hard, and guess what? It's like it inevitably branches different administrations and different things. It's like space is really difficult, and this is one of the things. It's like even I think of Kepler when that launched 9 years ago. 9 years ago before that launched, and that was in development for almost a decade before that. Kepler was actually proposed numerous times and got sent back to the drawing board. Science, you have to be in for the long haul.
Well, interestingly, since you bring up how long ago Kepler was both planned and launched, my understanding is that my iPhone has a lot more technology than was available 19 years ago.
Yeah.
So is that making exploration cheaper and easier in that you can use things that are smaller and lighter?
There is. Well, we have a whole... NASA has a whole collaboration around small satellites. You think of like CubeSats, if people know. You think of like a 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter. You put two of them together, it's almost like a loaf of bread. And with a swarm of these smaller satellites, I mean, right now there's students at universities that design small sats and launch them during the course of their school.
And who gives them a lift?
Then they hitch a ride basically on the rockets on like SpaceX, on these commercial, or ULA or Boeing, different launch systems. And what ends up happening is typically the NASA or the military or some telecommunications company will pretty much pay the bulk of it for the big satellite or thing that they're launching, or it may be a resupply to the space station, but then they fill the nooks and crannies with these smaller things like CubeSats and small sats. I've seen different concepts of using a swarm of small sats with the innards of a telephone and almost to create a version of a sat phone. That span the course, all of it spans a little much wider. You have a swarm of these small sats. Right now they're designed that they have to burn into the atmosphere, so it's not causing space debris. But there's actually even designs now of how would you take a small sat and add a drag and a parachute to it so that you could gather data, gather scientific things, and then or run an experiment even, and then let it come back, and so you can see what those results are. So yeah, there's that stuff is happening now.
Right. So Legos for space.
Basically.
I read somewhere that there's something called the space elevator. What floor would I get off to? How does that exactly work?
I have no idea about the space elevator. That's
Japan apparently.
I would
working
talk
on
to
something.
somebody else. This is the part where I email some people and be like, so my friend Marcos wanted to know
I
about
want to know about the space elevator. So this is another question here from the audience. How do partnerships with SpaceX and other private organization or designers begin? In other words, so you have this private organization, they're looking for for a partnership, and they want to design something. Is it start to end that you would work with SpaceX, or do they just pump a lot of money in first and then say, hey, I can't get this thing to lift off?
Because even the SpaceX situation is more of like, it's like a contract, like a contract company. It's like they're a contractor. We're paying for this service to launch things up in space. Partnerships, there's a whole mix of like partnerships at NASA.
Sure, but I think the question here is, how do they get to the design? I mean, is this an entirely independent and private enterprise so that they can develop or is there some engineering design and project collaboration on the process?
Definitely. There's definitely like collaboration. In fact, I believe somebody over at NASA Ames I was talking to helped design like certain aspects of the Dragon capsule that SpaceX uses. We like a lot of the information and the stuff that NASA works on, then we share it out.
Sure.
Even just on a different perspective is like autonomy. So one of the things that we work on is like autonomous systems. So you figure when you have robots working in Mars, and you can't really like joystick it from here because there's like the speed of light.
Yes.
And so you're gonna wait a while.
Right. It's the law.
Exactly. It's like you can't joystick things. Even joysticking like something to the moon, there's a delay, an annoying like time delay. So as we get into like working in Mars or working further out in the solar system and beyond, you start having to develop autonomous systems. Mm-hmm. So instead of having to babysit the robot what to do, you make it to a certain extent autonomous so that it knows what to do in most situations. And then from time to time has to have human touch base, but to deal with that time delay. And I mention that because one of the partnerships that NASA Ames has is with Nissan for some of their like self-driving cars that they're developing. Mm-hmm. But keep in mind, that's not just a single thing that we have going on with Nissan. NASA's work in autonomy, because is like ends up being shared with anybody that wants to use it. Right. And so there's like, in different companies, have used this information, like Google, different people who work on autonomous systems get to use and share in this information. We did have like a thing with Nissan specifically, because I remember what they were trying to do is having almost a hybrid approach of autonomous cars in a fleet, but imagine like an air traffic controller for a fleet of cars, where for the most part they're autonomous, but when something sees something that's weird, then that air traffic controller could jump into that car and remotely, oh, okay, I see it. It's in a construction site and it's a little weird. Car didn't understand it. Let me get them out. So that's the thing of working on that mixed hybrid system of autonomy, but then also, but there's a whole mix. I mean, even at NASA Ames, there's a NASA research park, which, if you think of Moffett Field, one chunk of it is NASA Ames. The rest of it is leased out to people. But you can't get the lease there unless there's like some sort of NASA, like some sort of synergy, some sort of like part of it. But there's a mix of, like Carnegie Mellon's there. There's small startups that exist there. Singularity University is another. They have a small company called Made in Space that had put one of the first 3D printers up in the International Space Station. Obviously, Google the Planetary Ventures has a presence on Moffett Airfield. So it's the cool thing is so related to the partnerships question.
Yes.
In Silicon Valley, there's no lack of partnerships. And I've kind of learned that like there's a lot of people who are excited and wanting to work with NASA on things.
Right. Well, anybody who's driven by Moffett Field down in the Silicon Valley, Ames Research, has noticed that you have this incredibly large structure, or had this incredibly large structure.
Hangar.
The hangar, which had dirigibles in it. Is that correct?
Or
is that just a rumor?
No, I mean, like, there's, because originally it was a Navy base, and there's a lot of, it's an EPA like Superfund site for a reason, and part of it is also like it's cleaning up that we have like an obligation and to help clean up some of that stuff. The hangar is an interesting one. I believe they're still working on trying to reskin it.
Yes.
But for my part, because I've only seen it naked like that,
Yes.
having only lived in the area for about 3 years. I kind of like it. It looks like modern art. But it wasn't a NASA structure. That's not a part of NASA.
Right.
It was a part of the military.
And that was part of my understanding was airship.
Yeah, I believe so. Yep.
And so does NASA delve in airships, or does Alphabet these days do anything with airships?
I don't think so. I think that's more of a historical landmark at this point in time. But no, yeah, that's one of the things, especially Ames, the most notable thing is this huge hangar structure, which was actually a part of the Navy, and it's not really not a part of ours.
Well, great. Here are some more questions. Let's see. How much autonomy do scientists at NASA actually have?
Quite a bit. Well, okay, this is the difference between the different NASA centers. There's kind of flight centers. When you're dealing with like human operations, there's like a mission culture. There's a lot stricter control and checks because you have like human lives at stake. So if you go to like Johnson or Kennedy, you'll notice
Which is in Houston.
Yes, Johnson Space Center in Houston or the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, Cape Canaveral. They don't mess around. It's more of a very rigid structure of this is like control and command and like what you do, what you don't do, because there's bigger things that are at stake. Very expensive things and also human lives. When you branch out into the research centers, so like Ames, Armstrong is in just outside of Lancaster, Palmdale, in Southern California. There's Glenn Research Center outside of Cleveland, Ohio. There's also Langley.
Named after John Glenn.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, who was a senator from Ohio.
Indeed, I was born in Michigan, but I grew up in Ohio. Okay. So, but yeah, so at the research centers, probably a little bit more leeway, a little bit more flexibility on what people work on. There's obviously funding that you can get from headquarters related to certain projects and initiatives, but a lot of times, like Bill Barucki, who wrote the concept for the Kepler telescope, he wrote that on his own. He actually wrote different papers and different concepts of coming up with the idea that you could stare at a star and capture the light from that star and detect the slightest dip as a planet crosses in front of it. And by measuring that and doing it over time, you can start to deduce that it's an actual planet going through it. I've heard it was the equivalent of like looking at a spotlight and seeing a fly fly in front of it. But Bill Barucki, on his like flexibility, like he wrote this paper and kept doing it. It kept getting like the whole concept for the mission. It was actually rejected a handful of times until eventually it made its way through, became a mission. They made it, and then it launched. And
that's great. And so can you, just in this vein, since you're doing this run across the country, whenever we watched, well, in the 60s when we were watching, 70s when we were watching television, we would always see people jumping up and down in Houston.
Yes.
Now it seems in the 21st century, whenever we see something remarkable happening in space, it's a bunch of students and scientists down in the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Southern California.
Yeah.
So what is the relationship between JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which is that a NASA center?
Yeah, we think of it as a NASA center. It's an FFRDC is what they call it, and then again, it's like I tortured acronyms. Yeah. This is like my alphabet soup for working in the government. It's like, you can Google it. Look at what FFRDC stands for. But it's like a mix because it's actually like, think of Caltech as a big contractor.
Yes.
So it's an entire NASA center that was created, which isn't like unheard of. I believe the Department of Energy is primarily like FFRDCs. But yeah, so like, at least from my perspective as the communications director, when we do a weekly call with all the comms directors at all the NASA centers, and like JPL's in there along with everybody else. So
they seem to be having an awful lot of fun. Whatever it is they're doing, every time they land something or move something.
Exactly. It's really exciting. So the stuff that they're working on.
I have one more here. So, and it's again sort of a global question, and then we'll move to audience questions live and wrap up the radio portion of this. Yeah. But what are some of the opportunities for U.S. adversaries? And here they're speaking specifically about Russia, to work in cooperation with the U.S. in this more strained moment.
I guess like a lot of it's already happening. Right now, like every American astronaut that's on the space station was launched in a Soyuz rocket. So the work, the collaboration. I mean, I heard it described. It's like that. NASA space exploration is the epitome of soft power. And we've been very fortuitous that that's been able to kind of stay above the fray amongst a lot of these contentious issues and things going on. So it's a fortuitous both we get to enjoy bipartisan support, but then on the international front for the most part, I mean that collaboration already exists and already works, and we hope that it's able to continue.
And certainly the competition is what got our space program going. The Sputnik moment was not just a moment; it was
Absolutely.
actually a satellite, and it led to Yuri Gagarin and the two dogs Laika and Chaika who got to get sent up into space.
But it does go to the point that it's not the American space station. It is the International Space Station, and it's international for a reason because it truly is an international collaboration.
Well, I want to thank you, Matthew,
This is fun.
for being here with us. Matthew Buffington, who's the Director of Communications at the NASA Ames Research Center and has joined us this evening. I appreciate your time.
Hey, thank you. This has been a lot of fun.